Well, good morning. This is actually a pop test with 8 questions, which is a little more difficult to score than a test with 10 questions. We'll start out going through the questions and then I'll explain the answers at the end. They're not all multiple choice questions, so some will require a little more thought instead of just having A, B, C, or D and just hope for the best, you know. Which wear-prone component on an engine receives unfiltered engine oil? The valve lifters, the cam bearings, the oil pump, or the timing gears? In a motor oil classified as CK4, what does the C stand for? Crust inhibiting, cold oil fueled, compression fired, or Carnegie oil grade? Each of the following statements is true except A. Engine oil pumps are positive displacement pumps. B. 10 psi per 1000 RPM is the minimum acceptable oil pressure. C. The lifters receive oil pressure right after the oil leaves the filter. Or D. Cam bearings on a given engine are all interchangeable. Watch the vacuum gauge. Low engine vacuum can be caused by all of these except EGR flow while idling, late ignition timing, the wrong engine oil, or retarded valve timing. Old car trivia. 52 Cadillac loses power badly while accelerating. Shop foreman sits down in the driver's seat, snaps the throttle once, and then tells the mechanic to replace the oil pump. See if you can figure out why this fixed it. Jeep driver emailed me and complained that his left front wheel kept coming off. He always torques his lug nuts with a torque wrench, and I sent a 1-sentence email back to him with one simple thing to do. It took care of the problem. What do you think I told him? 1991 Explorer runs good at diesels when you switch it off when it's hot. Tries to keep running, you know, hum-da-doom-da-doom-da-doom-da-doom. But when the engine is shut off, I found the problem and I fixed it in less than 5 minutes. What do you think I did? Alright, the check engine light's fastened. Look at that gauge. Vacuum gauge is doing that. Do we clean the injectors? Do we do a compression test? Do we replace the plugs? Or do we replace the EGR valve? Alright, let's get into these answers and we'll talk a little about why the answer is what it is. Alright, on this one here, it's the oil pump. Now you might say, well, it has the screen. Well, that screen doesn't stop much of anything really. I mean, it stops big heavy junk, but that screen can also get clogged up with crud and starve the pump, starve the oil pump, which starves the engine, which you can basically have a sludge in the oil pan that can clog that screen. There was this guy one time at the college that came to me and he was asking me why I thought he might have lost oil pressure on his Ranger. He was the guy that was doing some construction work on a project out at the college. And I says, you probably got a clogged up screen on your oil pump. And so he says, huh, okay, well, now that little rascal went out there and in the parking lot behind the shop, he jacked that thing up on a level place and he took the drain plug out, drained into a pan the oil that was in it. He got a little flashlight and he shined it up in there and he could see that the screen on the oil pump pickup was clogged up with mostly sludge. And so he took some spray and managed to reach up in there and wash that sludge off of that oil screen and clean that. I mean, he could get to it, believe it or not, on that one. He was able to see it through the oil drain plug hole. And he cleaned that screen and put it back together and put oil in it and got oil pressure again. That was just the most mind-boggling thing. I imagine that sludge he cleaned off, unless he figured out some way to get it out of the pan, probably got sucked back up there to stop that thing up again, but that just tickled me whenever he did that. In a motor oil classified CK4, C stands for compression fired. That's all for diesels. So anytime you see that first letter being a C, you know, that's going to be your compression fired oil. teeth got tangled up in my tongue. Each of the following statements is true except cam bearings on a given engine are all interchangeable. They're not. Those things are basically on not every last engine everywhere, but on a lot of these engines, the cam bearings are going to be different sizes for each journal. You know, those ring-looking cam bearings, and so you got to keep those things in order. Particularly, like for example, on a Jeep 4-liter. They'll either be color coded from if you get OEM ones, or they'll actually be have part numbers that tell you which one goes where, and they're in the box. Typically, they come in the box in the order that they're supposed to go in there, and you can't just put any cam bearing anywhere. You got to start at the back, you know, and work your way forward. Usually, they get just a tiny little bit larger as you come to the front. So somebody that doesn't know that is going to make a mess. They're trying to put cam bearings that are a little too big in a slightly smaller place. You know. Anyway, I've seen that in the shop. That's nasty. Low engine vacuum can be caused all except wrong engine oil. That's not going to cause low engine vacuum. Now I did see too much engine oil cause a vibration on a Ford Ranger one time. You know, they got these hoses you pull down from the ceiling, and the people in the parts room would, you know, set 5 on the pump, and they would pull the trigger and just let it go in there. And somehow they wound up with 5 on the pump and 5 again on the same pump. The guy, when he pulled the trigger, he put like 8 or 10 quarts of oil in the engine. And that particular Ranger had a vibration. They gave it to me because it had a vibration, but it didn't have a vibration before the oil change. And when I pulled the dipstick out, the oil was way under up the stick. So I drained it down to where it only had 5 quarts of oil in it. The vibration went away. Now you won't always have a vibration because of that. This one lady brought her 92 Buick or whatever it was out there. She was somebody that I thought was pretty sharp. And she had poured oil in her engine until she could see it in the valve cover. And she brought it out there, and it was, you know, smoking stuff. And I looked at it and I said, "How much oil did you put in these things?" She said, "Well, I didn't know how much you needed. I just kept pouring in there until I could see it." So we had to drain a bunch of oil out of hers too. I knew this Oldsmobile one time, this '86 Oldsmobile. This lady would be driving along, and she would hear pinging and spark knocking, and she'd see a bunch of blue smoke come boiling out behind the car. Ever so often, it didn't happen all the time. And when I checked her oil, it was way over full. And I said, "How did you wind up with so much oil in here?" She says, "Well, whenever she went to a full service gas station she had found somewhere, and the guy, you know, poured an extra quart of oil in there that she didn't need, you know." So that's an easy trap to fall into, particularly on some of these 200X year model, or like 2012, 2015 GMCs and Chevrolet pickups with the LS engine. That oil won't drain back into the pan and give you a true reading on your dipstick until you let it sit for a while. And sometimes when people pull it up, or if they park it hot and they pull the dipstick out, they can say, "Oh no, I'm a quart low on oil." Well, if they checked it an hour later, it would be full. Well, they keep pouring oil in there, and they wind up with too much oil in it, see? And so I kind of got off on a tangent there, but the wrong engine oil is not going to cause low engine vacuum. On this old car trivia, that Cadillac losing power, this was told to me by a guy that had a machine shop that I used to talk to. He was a guy that I knew from our community, and he had this machine shop up there, and he had worked at the Cadillac dealership in the big town up the road back in the 40s and 50s. And now this was in the 70s when I knew this guy, and I think he died in the late 1980s, but anyway, his name was Cliff. And I was talking to him one day at the machine shop, and he was a talkative son of a gun. And he said that the doctor came in there, the Cadillac losing power, and he said there were 2 shop foremen at the Cadillac place at the time, and he was one of them. And the other one couldn't, had his guys working on it, couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. And he said, well, he sat down in it. He said, "I sat down in the seat, and I revved the engine up, and I watched the oil pressure gauge, and it pegged out." And he says, "And I just got out, and I told the guy, put an oil pump in it." And the guy said, "I don't believe that's what's wrong with it." And he says, "Well, I'll bet you $100. And so the guy says, "Okay, $100 bet it is." And so his other shop foreman had his mechanics change the oil pump, and it took care of it. Well, on a newer vehicle, like the ones we drive today that's got these screw-on oil filters, if the oil pressure relief valve happens to stick on one of these, it will blow the oil filter slam off of it. And so back in those days, the Cadillac had this, and like a lot of the older GM cars, the Cadillac oil filter was a whole lot more, it could hold more pressure. You know, like you might remember some of the 350s in these Chevy, old Chevy small block V8s. They had this real thick can that went up over the filter element with a big bolt going up through the middle of it, and that thing can handle a lot of pressure. Today's oil filters can't handle a lot of pressure, but this oil pump relief valve is in here, and it's oil pump. You know, you pull that cotter key out, there's a spring comes out, there's a little plunger that comes out there anyway. And you see, this was driven by the distributor. Like, that looks going to be familiar to the GM guys. Even back in '52, they were doing it that way. Jeep driver emailed me and told me his left front wheel kept coming off. He says he'd worked on that thing repeatedly, and the lug nuts kept coming loose and coming off. And what I told him was, I says, take one lug nut from each of the other wheels and put them on that wheel and torque them. If they don't come loose, you need to get the right lug nuts for that wheel. And that's what he did. And that took care of his problem. He emailed me back. That's when I used to operate a website called askamechanic.info, and people would email me with problems, and I'd try to help them if I could. That website went away because eventually what happened was I didn't update the Joomla, you know, to the latest, and finally one day it just crashed, and I couldn't recover all of the stuff I had already posted. So I just went ahead and said, heck with that, I'm not going to start over and build a new website. I just let that go. But the long and the short of it was, all he needed to do was get the right lug nuts, because if you got the wrong angle lug nuts, there's a guy that I knew that bought a Chevelle that was brand spanking new back in the early 70s, and I think it was a 71 or 72 Chevelle, a blue one, and had racing stripes on it and all, and he had some fancy chrome wheels put on there, and first one and then the other of his wheels would come off while he was driving down the road. And I didn't until years later figure out that whenever they put the chrome wheels on there, they just used either the original lug nuts, or they used some with the wrong taper or something, and his kept coming loose. And I don't know if he ever figured that out. But I mean, the wheel would come off and go scooting off over there, you know. And the anyway, enough about that. 91 Explorer runs good, but dieseling, tries to keep running, runs very poorly. When you switch it off, it would diesel, and, you know, like you've heard the cars with carburetors, you know, if you got them idle a little too high or something, or, you know, you can have them because the timing's a little too high or something like that. If it's getting any air, though, usually if it's getting air, if they're idle a little too high and the throttle's not completely closing when you shut them down, it will keep pulling air in there, and it will, the hot coals from the carbon on the cylinder head will actually light off the mix that's being drawn in through the carburetor. This was a fuel injected engine. Now granted, the injectors were bank fired, they weren't sequential on this 91 Explorer, but it was dieseling, and that was given to me for that reason. So in 5 minutes I figured out what was wrong with it. Now this is what the deal was. Whenever the ignition system was offline and the ECM was asleep, see, the engine heat power relay feeds the injectors and all the other solenoids that are operated by the engine controller, including transmission solenoids, and it also feeds the engine controller. So when you turn on the key, this comes down here. Yeah, this is grounded, and it also provides a couple of grounds to the engine controller. All right, and it snaps this relay closed, and power goes from here to the keep alive power. See, you notice it actually is always here, and this is the keep alive power pin, pin 1 on the 60-pin engine controller. All right, and then when that relay closes, this power from here is fed to the fuel injectors, and again into the engine controller. All right, now let's look at the next slide. The ignition system's online. When you switch it on, everything's working like it's supposed to. You notice this is in run. All right, I've fired these up red. All right, this is grounded, so I left it green. These are going to be a pulsed ground. The relay closes. Click. Okay, so this is carried up here to the injectors, and also the ignition feeds the coil. So the coil is powered up, through the ignition switch, and they've got this capacitor here and all that. And then you've also got a connection over here to the EDIS module. That's an electronic. That's a morphodite thing that only lasted 2 or 3 years before Ford started putting the ignition controls inside the engine controller. You know, the EDIS module. And anyway, so here's what happened when you switched it off on this one. When you switched it off, this relay was stuck. The contacts, most every time, would stay closed. Sometimes they'd open, sometimes they wouldn't. And you notice the ignition system went dark when you turned off the key. This relay was stuck closed, so this power was keeping the engine control unit alive. It was also keeping the injectors alive. And as long as the engine control unit is alive, it's going to keep looking at the crank sensor. And when it sees crank sensor movement, that EDIS module is going to send that signal, that profile ignition pickup signal, to the engine control module, and it's going to use that to fire these injectors. Now this is bank fired, you know, one pins 58, 59, I think it was. It kept pulsing the injectors, it kept putting fuel in there, and it was just, when the engine was hot, it would do like an old carbureted vehicle that's got too much. We've got air still going through there. You know, some of them Asian carburetors and some of the small Ford carburetors, like on Escorts and stuff, they had a solenoid in there that would close off the idle passage so it wouldn't diesel when you shut it off. There was some of them, one, I forgot which one it was, would close the PCV when you switched it off. It had a solenoid hooked in the PCV hose, and it would close that to keep it from dieseling. So air getting in there when it's not supposed to be, and it's still pulling fuel through the carburetor, will cause it to diesel if everything's not right. And it's more of a problem on some vehicles than the others. I don't know if you ever saw that Don't Tell Her It's Me movie from 1990 with Steve Guttenberg, but there was a girl on this movie that was driving a big old Buick. She parked in front of this house, switched that big old Buick off, and it was sitting there dieseling and puffing out black smoke and all that kind of thing and making all that tunk, 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 tunk noise. She went in the house, went up the stairs, went all the way into the top part of the house, came back down. When she went back to the car, it was still dieseling. If it's still dieseling, you can just switch the key back on and it'll be running again. You know, it's just funny as all get out. I mean, I don't know. You know, if you were wanting to make a vehicle, if you're one of the mechanics for a movie like that, you wanted to make the vehicle diesel for that amount of time, you know, somebody was pretty sharp that knew how to do that. But that thing, they had the camera on the car the whole time. You could see it dieseling and all. All right, so question 8. You do a compression test on this one. That's what you do. All right, if the vacuum gauge shows this, we do a compression test. If you see a bouncing needle, you got low compression, presumably be an intake valve on that particular cylinder. Now, there are times whenever you would see, even if the exhaust camshaft lobe is rounded off, and that valve is not opening much or at all, it will backfire like a machine gun out the intake and out the carburetor. That's one of the ways, you know, GM and the small block Chevy used to be horrible to do that. And my sister had a 77, well, she wound up driving a 77 Caprice, and my dad bought it for $100. And it was doing that. It was pop, 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 pop like a machine gun when it was running out the carburetor. And I said, that's the camshaft there. And so my dad and I put a camshaft in that thing, but it was a 305 engine. We couldn't find a camshaft for a 305 right easily, so we went in, and we didn't want to buy a new one, so we got a used camshaft for 350, and we put that in there, and that thing ran really good when we got it put in there. Boy, did it ever suck gas, you know. Anyway, that's another story. All right, do a compression test. All right, here we are. We're gonna bail out with this one. I want you guys to tell me how you did on this thing, and I hope you enjoyed it. We've been here nearly 20 minutes. I'll see you next week, and I hope to get some comments and likes and that kind of thing. Until next time.